Welcome. We're talking about reverb. No, not delay, reverb. We're going into all things reverb today here at theworshipinitiative.com. We're going to talk about what reverb is. We're going to talk about how to achieve a good reverb sound, all the different controls and parameters that some pedals have for you to manipulate your reverb sound. We're going to talk about a couple of different pedal options for you to look at. And then we're going to look at how, when, and why to use reverb, how to apply what we'll cover in this video into your setting on the team that you're a part of at your church. So man, just like every time we do one of these videos, we're going to ask the question, why does this even matter? Why spend a whole chunk of time looking at reverb pedals as a worship musician? And it's because, man, we want to steward the resources that God has given us so that we can serve Jesus faithfully. We can help, as a musician, serving on our team, create beautiful art that says true things about God, that's really clear and purposeful and compelling, and that learning how to use a reverb pedal is a part of that. And so we're just going to jump in to understanding how to use reverb today. But before we can do that, we've got to know what it is. And man, the best shorthand kind of way to think about reverb that I have found is to just think about reverb as putting my sound in a certain kind of space. We've all been in a long concrete hallway or big room and clapped our hands and heard all these reverberations, and that's reverb. So or you've been in a smaller room and you've clapped your hands and you've heard a different kind of reverb. And so reverb pedals are just helping put your sound, your guitar sound, in a certain kind of space to create a certain kind of effect. And so that's what reverb is. So we'll look at how to use these different types of reverbs really purposefully. But before we jump into what's a hall reverb, what's a room reverb, what's a spring reverb, there's some controls that you'll see on some different pedals that will apply to any of those sounds. So before we even look at specific sounds, I want to look at these controls with you first. And so, man, the first thing to look at is the decay. The decay is how long your reverb sound is. So here's a reverb with a really long decay. And then you've got a reverb with a really short decay. And so you've put your sound, just by messing with that one knob, you've put your sound in two different kinds of spaces. So your decay is basically how long your reverb sound is. Next is the mix control. That's basically how much of your dry sound versus your reverb sound you're going to hear. So here is just a tiny little bit of the reverb sound mixed in with my dry sound. You can barely hear it. Here's just a little more. Versus when I turn the mix knob all the way up. You really only hear just the reverb signal, just the affected signal, and none of your dry signal. And so how you blend that in will sort of determine basically where you as the listener are in comparison to the original sound. So versus standing at the far end of a hallway from the person who's yelling at you, and you hearing their voice mainly as echoes, versus if you were sitting 6 inches from the person who's yelling. Those are going to be different sounds, and your mix knob is what controls sort of your distance from the original sound source. The next thing is going to be pre-delay. This is sometimes a confusing parameter to control, but hopefully looking at some of these things today will remove some of that fear and confusion. Pre-delay is how long from when you initially hit your strings, how long between that and when the reverb signal kicks in. So here's a really short pre-delay for you to hear. You pretty much instantaneously hear the reverb sound. Versus if I turn the pre-delay up quite a bit, there's a little bit of delay, there's some time before you hear that sound kick in. And then here's an even more extreme version of that. I would never use that sound, but I think it helps communicate kind of what pre-delay is doing. And I'll dig in a little bit more towards the end of this video, how I apply that particular parameter to my reverb sounds. But for now, just suffice it to say, pre-delay is how long between when your dry sound, the distance between your dry sound and when the reverb sound kicks in. So the next The next thing is tone. If you have an electric guitar, you know what tone does. It's the exact same thing on a reverb pedal. It's how dark versus how bright your reverb sound is. So here's with the tone knob all the way up on my reverb pedal. You hear some high end, it's more splashy, versus if I turn the reverb or the tone knob all the way down on my reverb pedal, it's a lot darker, there's not as much high end, so that allows you to sort of craft and shape some of the intensity. Like a brighter sound is going to feel more intense versus a more mellow sound with the tone knob rolled off. And then lastly, you've got a mod control. Some reverb pedals will have this, some don't. Some just have a setting called mod that's a reverb type that's adding this in. But mod is modulation. It's adding pitch shifting, some chorusing effect to just the reverb sound, just the trails on your reverb. So I'll show you. It might be subtle and hard to hear, but if you have a reverb pedal with this option on it, go and try this on your pedal so that you can hear what it sounds like. But here is with no modulation on this reverb sound. Okay, and versus when I turn it all the way up. So you can hear just a little bit. There's a little bit more kind of swirliness. It's got some pitch modulation going on. And that's going to be really great for pad sounds and when you're trying to do more atmospheric, textural, volume swell kind of stuff. That mod control can be really useful in helping create that sound. And then, man, those are the controls that go into crafting and creating and shaping a reverb sound. And so since we've covered those now, we can jump into different types of reverb. There's so many different types, but we'll look at what I've kind of distilled to 5 main buckets. So I've pulled out spring reverb, room reverb, hall reverb, plate reverb, and then what I've just, for our purposes today, have called specialty reverbs. Different pedals will have different options of these specialty verbs like church verb or choral or whatever, but those tend to be for more atmospheric sound. So I'll show you those here in a bit. But first is spring reverb. Old Fender amps are what made spring reverb famous. It was literally a coiled up spring in the back of the amp, and the sound would get run through it, and the coils of the spring moving back and forth were blended in with the original sound. And so this is what spring reverb sounds like. So you could hear some splashiness, kind of literally like the boingy sound of a spring is what you hear with a spring reverb. I tend to not use that sound a whole lot just because it's got a really strong characteristic. It's just that sound is not something that I'm often looking for, but it's a good sound to have for country music, and for surf music is when I tend to find myself wanting that kind of sound. The next sound is, let's look at a room reverb. A room reverb is what it sounds like. When we talk about reverb is putting our sound in a space. A room reverb is like putting your sound in a room, and you can, with different reverb pedals, change how big the room is. But the idea is just to create a really natural sound with room reverb. So I like room reverb as kind of an always-on sound. It puts my sound kind of in reference to other things by putting it in a space, as opposed to just having my sound really close and really direct sounding. So I like using room reverb for that. The next sound that we can look at will be hall reverb. A hall, essentially, for the way I think about it, is a really big room. Think about a concert hall or a big convention center room at a conference center or a hotel or whatever. This is just a really big room. So I tend to have longer sounds, longer decay times when I use hall reverb. So hall, a really big room, essentially. The next one to look at would be plate reverb. Plate reverb is made famous by studios in the 60s and 70s would use these big metal plates, and the sound would get piped into them and would reverberate between those plates, and there would be a microphone picking up that sound. And so plate reverb is designed to simulate that sound on your reverb pedal. I like using plate reverbs. They tend to be a little more bright, a little more, they just have a metallic sound because they're metal plates that I tend to find really pleasing for my ear. So here is, I'll switch between a room reverb and a plate reverb just for you to hear the difference. So that plate reverb to me sounds a little brighter, a little splashier, and not quite as just warm and mellow. So I like using plate reverbs for those brighter sounds. The last one in terms of reverb types that we'll look at is what I've just called specialty verbs. For our purposes in this video, because I'm using this Strymon Big Sky, the specialty reverb that I use the most is called the cloud reverb. I don't know what reverb in a cloud sounds like, but it must be this. And I use this for my pad sounds. I have longer decay times, more modulation, and that's what I've found using reverb pedals. These kind of specialty sounds are good for. So here is that cloud setting and how I use it with pads. There's one other sound that I use a lot on this pedal. It's called the choral setting. And the reverb on it, you can literally change like the vowel sound that a choir would be making, whether it's an ah or an oo. So I have this set for an even wetter, even longer decay time for when I want something really spacey. So here is that sound. So that's a really helpful sound that I use with doing swells, and if I want something more washy and ethereal, that's been a helpful sound for me. So those are the main buckets of reverb: spring, room, hall, plate, and then those specialty verbs that we tend to use for pad sounds. There's so many pedals in the world, so many different types of reverb pedals. We've got two here for you today because these are the two that I own. And the first one is the one that I've been using in this video, the Strymon Big Sky. It is intense, and there's a lot that goes into using this pedal, but once I figured it out, I just really have loved using it. It's got a bunch of different presets, so I can save sounds. I can go from this really short room sound to a really long pad sound at the click of a button, which is helpful for me when I'm switching between songs or trying to come up with a new idea here in the studio, whatever it might be. Just gives me access to a lot of different sounds really quickly. So I have been using that pedal really only for the last 6 or 7 months. But for the last 6 or 7 years, I was using this little red guy right here, the TC Electronics Hall of Fame reverb. It's got 11 different reverb types and many of the same controls that something that's a bit larger like the Big Sky would have. It's got an effects level, it's got a decay knob, it's got a tone knob, it's even got a switch to adjust the pre-delay. So you have some pretty big control over your reverb sound in this small, relatively inexpensive reverb box. The Hall of Fame, I think new, is about $150, $145. The Big Sky new is about $500, but there's used pedals, and everything that I have bought has been used, and so they'll be cheaper that way. But both of these would be great options for you to look at if you're wanting to jump into reverb for the first time, or you've been using it for a while and want to upgrade. These would be two pedals that I would definitely recommend for you. So lastly, we've looked at these parameters, how to control and manipulate different reverb sounds. We've looked at different types of reverb sounds. We've talked about what reverb is by placing our sound in a space. And so now we want to look at, how do I use reverb? When do I use reverb? Why should I use reverb? And and how can I, for our purposes here, in a worship context, use this sound most effectively. And so the first one that I think worship music and guitar players are kind of always spending time thinking about is how to do the more ambient textural pad sounds. And so, like I showed you earlier, I've got this choral verb that's really long, a 7-second decay, 7.17 seconds actually, according to the Big Sky. And it's got a pretty long decay, a pretty high mix. I've got the modulation turned up quite a bit, and my pre-delay is as short as I can get it because I want this reverb sound kicking in right away. Because if I didn't, and I had it like this, I would swell in, and it would take a second for that sound to kick in, but I'm needing all that washiness right away. So I have my pre-delay knob turned all the way down. So when you're thinking about your pad sounds, I tend to have a delay or two on going into my pad sound as well to help extend and make things even washier. But for sure, I need my decay to be really long on my reverb pedal. I want to have my mix pretty high, and I want to have some modulation on there as well. And then the tone you can sort of adjust to taste. I tend to have mine set somewhere in the middle, just so I'm not super dark and not really bright and splashy. So this is what my pad sound that I use sounds like. I'll turn on a delay pedal as well. So that sound is one that you'll find yourself using a lot. So learning how to dial in that sound with some of the principles we've talked about will be really important. The next thing and that we want to look at is maybe a more medium length, medium mix reverb for when you're maybe strumming real big, you want to have some more intensity, but you don't want this big pad sound. So I'll kick on an overdrive pedal like if I was playing bigger in a song and show you kind of what I'm talking about. I'll switch between a hall reverb and a room reverb just to sort of show you the different sounds. So here's that hall sound. So I was switching between like a longer hall sound with a higher mix and a shorter room sound. And so I like having that longer sound sort of filling in the gaps of when I'm playing that more percussive part. It washes out the sound and kind of gives you this big wall of sound that's coming at you and helps make your sound feel bigger, more full. Where the room reverb to my ear when I listen back makes it feel a little smaller. When I'm wanting that big push of sound, I'm just not getting that from that shorter decay time. And so I'll have that set at just below 12 o'clock on my mix for this hall sound, and the decay is at about 3 seconds. So using a sound like that when you're strumming out really big is really helpful to fill out your sound, but you're not too dry, but you're also not just doing this big washy wet sound. Because if I was playing that exact same part but with my pad reverb, you just lose all of your notes. The notes go away. It just becomes this washy, noisy mess that when we talk about not wanting to be distracting but wanting to be really purposeful with using the effects that we have, that feels like the opposite of being non-distracting and purposeful. It feels chaotic and distracting to me. So learning to use reverb that fits the occasion that of where you are in the song. If the band's really big, I don't need this really huge, massive pad sound because the keys player is probably covering some of that big, washy, huge space, and I need something a little shorter so that I can just mainly focus on sounding like a guitar. The third thing is one that we already talked about a little bit, is just using a room reverb as maybe an always-on sound to sort of put your sound in a space. The difference, like I said, between somebody talking 3 inches from your ear versus 3 feet from you, one feels a lot more natural. And so having just a little bit of a room reverb on, I'll show you kind of how I set that. and I'll turn it on and off so you can hear the difference. So you could hear one is really dry, really tight, really direct sounding, and one feels a little bit more like you're just listening in a room. And so I like having a room sound just kind of always available to kick on, to put my guitar just in a normal sounding space. So lastly, we've already talked about Pitfalls a little bit, but one of the common things that I notice when I'm just out listening at other churches or talking with younger guitar players who've asked for help with sounds is that we tend to overuse the really long, washy reverb sounds for when we're strumming really big and when we're in these big sections, and that it actually kind of makes your guitar feel smaller in a mix than bigger. It might sound really great in your room by yourself, but in the context of a band, it doesn't really fit. So just as a little nugget for you, when you're strumming really big, try to avoid as much as you can some of those really long, washy sounds. And then using pre-delay on reverbs. I like to have, when I'm playing on those bigger strummy sections, I like to have a longer pre-delay so that my direct sound is cutting through. So I'm getting some of that punch in the larger section, but it's waiting a little bit for that washy sound to kick in and sort of fill in some of the gaps and make things feel a little more full without being this immediate wet reverb sound. So adjusting pre-delay there will be a trick that's helpful for you as well in your larger sections of songs. So, man, I hope that's been helpful for you as we've looked at how to use reverb pedals today, all the different parameters, all the different reverb types. So be sure, if you have more questions, to check out this video again maybe, or to feel free to reach out to us here at the Worship Initiative. Be sure, though, to check out the other effects training videos we have. I have a whole video that's about 30 minutes long where I walk through my whole pedal board and how I use each of the tools that I have to accomplish some of the sounds that I'm going for. And then we've got, song training videos for you to learn the parts to different songs that your church might be singing. We've got some fundamentals and some theory training for you as well. And then we've got Bible training for you and for your team so that you're growing not just in your gifting, but in your knowledge of the Scriptures, your love for the Lord, that we want to come alongside you and be of help to you and your team. And so be sure to check out all of those things and all of the other resources that we've created for you over at theworshipinitiative.com. Blessings. It's so intense. I love it.